There were some stickers that were overstocked. Sticker overstock is about an inch tall, so I figured that was not worth doing anything about. The labor to resolve that is more expensive than just like waiting for the passage of time for that stack to reduce. Yes, we can send overstock stickers to shows, but then you would have to be standing behind the political positionings of the unpopular stickers at these shows.
Happy to do that.
Don't blame me. I voted for Gary Coleman.
This is my favorite podcast episode ever.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Ellie Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
I've been invited many times to learn about the topic of like, how do we make publishing environmentally friendly? And that's, and it's kind of like held up as this like ideal that is impossible and thus like kind of hand-wringy, as in like it's aspirational but just not possible. But the reality is it's actually pretty simple. And I don't know why this isn't addressed more directly, but the way to make publishing environmentally friendly is to eliminate waste by printing the correct amount of books close to home geographically. So like rather than printing too many in China and shipping them around the world, you would print the correct amount in your region and print more when you need more, rather than this kind of, the usual way it's done, which is, as anybody who has worked in a warehouse can tell you, with every single book, you either have too many or too few, and there isn't really a whole lot of in between there. So, and in some cases, as we'll see here, the difference between too many and too few can be very dramatic. So fortunately, incidentally, not coincidentally, this is also the economically responsible and the ergonomic choice, because you're not having money tied up in inventory, and you have a walkable warehouse. Oh yeah, thank you, Lance, for bringing this topic to the forefront. And so so like this issue also affects feng shui, and ideally you would have space for books that actually sell. So it's kind of a win-win-win-win-win. But I do think, I haven't entirely gotten to the bottom of why people are so resistant to best practices here, industry-wide, So what causes all of this waste in publishing, now that we've solved this within the first 3 minutes? So the problem is caused by a culmination of 4 factors. Most books experience 75% of their sales within their first year. And that's just kind of like the way the industry has been built. And it's kind of the way that people know how to drum up buzz and enthusiasm, that's kind of the consequence. Publishers desperately do not want to run out of inventory during those like crucial first 90 days of a window. Publishers do not want, they just don't have a mechanism to predict or measure how large the print run should be. And most people will just honestly say, oh, I just guess, like I really have no idea, so I just guess, and then that is what we print. And you're like, well, surely there's a better way to do it than that. And in the past 3 years, warehouses dramatically increased storage costs. So those kind of 4 factors together. So again, it's that, you don't want to run out of books. You're going to have most of your sales immediately. That's also like, you're going to miss out on sales if you don't have inventory in your first 90 days. And it's super expensive to have outsourced storage now, or it's more expensive than it used to be, let's say. So after a year, the distributor calculates how much overstock they have in their warehouse, and that's based on sales of the previous year. So that's like hard data. It's a little bit buggy, but it is based on hard data. And then they begin billing the publisher for each copy stored beyond what they would consider the reasonable amount. And that's like usually another year of inventory. So because of that first 90-day period where all the activity is happening, by month 13, you're going to watch that what a year of inventory looks like just drop off dramatically. And so instantly you went from having like a comfortable amount of stock to having way too much inventory, and you're suddenly getting bills. And sometimes those bills can be rather scary, as we will see in a few examples later on. So it's like a ticking clock, for those of us that experience anxiety, it's like a great example of that. It's like kind of like watching your cell phone run out of battery as you're like about to hit an important appointment or something. So, and it can be pretty dramatic. The part of the important backstory here is a seemingly unrelated court case in 1979 where Thor Power Tool tried to argue with the IRS that their inventory was less valuable than the cost to replace it. And the IRS took them to court, and Thor Power Tool lost. And now it became US law that your inventory is valued at the cost to replace it. So that essentially screwed publishers, because all of a sudden you had to pay taxes on all of your inventory as well. So every year, everything that's left, you have to pay taxes on, because that's an asset, And so within 2 years, let's say, if you have too much between taxes and storage fees, you're essentially buying another print run if you have overstocked in the first place. And so you might be apprehensive to get rid of it immediately, but pretty quickly you're going to be like, oh, maybe we should have gotten rid of that. So the effect of this is the publishers are incentivized to get rid of overstock immediately, because it's the ticking clock and the bill and all that. So Thor Power Tool losing to the IRS was likely the biggest boon ever for the creation of the remaindering industry in 1979. There isn't a lot of documentation about it prior to that. Essentially, obviously overstock existed before Thor Power Tool v. IRS in 1979, but we just don't have a lot of, the industry didn't exist in the organized way that it does now. So remaindering is a liquidation process that publishers use to avoid these storage fees and taxes. In most cases, these are the books that have slowed down over time. But, it's more likely, as the book market became increasingly saturated, these are just the books that were overprinted in the first place, especially from smaller publishers. The smaller publishers are the ones that tend to bite off more than they can chew and are like more ambitious than their reality. Whereas the larger publishers will have like corporate policy where they're like, we purge this at this point because of XYZ, and we've determined this is the best practice. So it's kind of like, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And, neither of them are wrong. It's just more that like this problem can be stemmed in the first place. So we're going to take a look at 2 fairly epic case studies. So the first one is a book that I posted on Slack, I believe last year, maybe in 2022. It's been kind of a while. It's called Imaginable: How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, Even Things That Seem Impossible Today, which is sort of a, ominous and ironic name for a book that is about to be massively remaindered. That it was indeed imaginable. But Imaginable is the third book by Jane McGonigal, whose first book for Penguin sold about 75,000 copies. Penguin also published her second book, but that only sold 12,000 copies, which, like, for most people at most publishers in the industry, 12,000 is like a great number, even if it's not as great as 75,000. And so for her third book, Jane was picked up by the independent press Spiegel and Grau, who I am probably severely mispronouncing your probably French name, for which I apologize. So for Imaginable, her publisher highlighted the sales of her first book and boasted that the first printing of Imaginable would also be 75,000 copies, which is like maybe too ambitious. Like, ambition is good, but maybe this is not the best way to be ambitious. So this sort of bluster is meant to come across as, you know, showing how seriously a publisher is taking this book and how much they're investing in a new title. So it's like a way to kind of like create buzz. So you're like, they're doing 75,000 as the first printing, so we should probably get, you know, 7 times the amount we would have normally purchased. And, you know, part of this is that you're essentially incentivizing over ordering. You're trying to get on the New York Times list by getting people to stock up too much. And then you sort of know that because of that, you're going to get a lot of heavy returns. But, you know, where the stores and the wholesalers will like buy more than they can sell and they'll just return the rest. And this is like kind of a time, you know, honored strategy for some unknown reason. But I think it's partially because, like, for an author like that that's had previous successes, it's just like another way to, you know, make it a key title to essentially try to get extra oomph behind it. So at the same time, it's understood that first printing 75,000 copies doesn't actually mean 75,000. It's almost always an exaggeration. So, and you know, we were once trained about 10 years back about there's actual like proportional mathematics to the exaggerations. So if you say I'm printing 100,000 first printing, that actually only means like 40,000. So in this case, it probably means something more akin to 25,000 when you say 75,000. And again, it's kind of like, if everybody is in on this, then like, why don't you just use the real numbers? But like, I'm not here to write the law. I'm just here to report on the law. So this is a weird thing that people created complicit, you know, dishonest science, but like, it's kind of like what the industry operates on. So we've kind of just avoided like announcing print runs as a marketing tool because, you know, it's like, if everybody knows it's dishonest, is it actually getting you where you want to go? Would be my first question. So BookScan figures show lifetime sales of 10,000 copies of Imaginable, and only 1,100 of those were sold in the second year of publication. So that's, you know, that means that 13 months after publication, 13,000 copies were offered on remainder auction, meaning this is, you know, they kind of showed their hand. They like gave us the entire picture because we now know what's sold and we know what they're desperately trying to get rid of, which means the guess was correct. They did print 25,000. They sold 9,000 in the first year. It sold 1,100 in the second year. The publisher can only keep 1,100 copies at their distributor without paying for storage. That number will decrease every year. They were motivated to get rid of most of the print run for less than they paid for them, very likely. I mean, an auction in this case, it's not like when you auction off your like collectible painting. It's more like, you know, that people aren't paying their usual price less discount. You're saying like, what about $1? Oh, 50 cents. Oh, okay. 36 cents. Okay. Well, if you'll take them all, is kind of the way that conversation goes. So based on these figures, it seems safe to assume that the publisher probably lost money on this book. You know, between the author's advance, which is based on anticipated copies sold, you pay for design, editorial, and development, and you pay for the cost of printing. So, like, all told, these probably fully negated the revenues from the book. And it seems that the unconsidered factor is that flooding the market with 13,000 copies on auction is likely going to undermine their ability to sell even that 1,100 copies per year, that it's going to like further just drive it into the ground. So, you know, if people weren't willing to pay full price, you're going to watch the, you know, sort of the price as determinant factor for sale doctrine come into effect. Like, you know, so what you'll see is that secondhand sites will become flooded with the book, and then it will be, you know, half price, less than half price, significantly, you know, and you've probably seen this for books like all over the internet. This is kind of like what happens. So to me, the imaginable takeaway with imaginable is that the boasting of a big print run almost always backfires. By claiming to go big, you're just taking bigger risks, and you're more likely to lose big unless, you know, and even if you have a big author like this who has done well in the past, you know, there's a reason that Penguin is letting that book go, you know, because like Penguin is the bigger publisher. They sort of saw the writing on the wall and probably said, okay, well, she sold 12,000 of her second book. She's probably going to sell about 12,000 of her third book, maybe not even that. So, you know, we can let this one go. Because part of the other problem of this scenario is that Jane is probably retained by a fantastic literary rights agency whose job is to get her paid as much as she can possibly be paid for her next book. And having your first book sell 75,000 is fantastic. So that puts you in a really good place for your second book, and then to some degree your third book, but not necessarily your fourth book. So, you know, this kind of brings us to my biggest and most important point, is that, you know, when I was doing the research for the People's Guide to Publishing book, one of my mentors told me that the number one mistake they see over and over and over, and, you know, honestly, they actually couldn't think of a second mistake after I probed around this. They came back and said, the only mistake I see over and over in publishing is people printing too many. Like it's such a catastrophic mistake. It's essentially the only way to put your company out of business. Because every other mistake you make once and you learn from, whereas this one, for some reason, publishers just keep overprinting. And, you know, this has been consistent and true for when I've consulted for publishers, is they just cannot get away from like, oh, but we just print 5,000 because we know our books are really good and we know that that's what we want to sell. So we just think that will catch up with us instead of us catching up with like the amount we're actually selling. So, you know, which brings me to our second case study. So in 2007, we printed 3,000 copies of Raleigh Briggs' first book, Make Your Place. And it was, you know, a cute book, not unlike many of the other books we were publishing at the time. And, you know, we did many drafts of cover revisions with her, you know, because we really kind of saw this could, you know, it could be, we didn't really think of it as like anything more than like just the book we were doing that month. But, you know, we wanted it to have a good cover. And some of the initial drafts, like they looked like children's books and they weren't really right for what we were doing. And, you know, this was kind of about the time we were getting more serious about that. So we sold out of those first 3,000 quickly, and then we reprinted 5,000 more. And for most books, this is about like the extent of their sales life. This is you do the second printing when you sell out the first printing that fast, and then you sort of watch it slow down, and then what you have left of that 5,000 is enough for the next year, but then things slow down a little bit, so then what you have left the following year is enough, like, and then it sort of like works that way in perpetuity. So you're never stuck with too many, but you also don't have too few, and you're also not in a position where you need to reprint. But in this case, few things prepared us for when a mom blogger, this was a very popular kind of phenomenon at the time, that moms blogging about momming was it's hard to really understand what was captivating the internet around this issue in 2008, but it was. She wrote about the book and just gave it this glowing, like, this is the best thing ever. This is great for like cleaning my house. This is great for all kinds of projects. And simultaneously, Boing Boing wrote about the book and tested a bunch of the recipes and created, really in-depth, but very unquotable sort of, what would be like a feature magazine piece in the era of magazines about the book. And the book had been out for about a year at this point, so we were absolutely not prepared for this. And we had both of these reviews come out, and we were like, oh, that's nice. That's pretty cool. And, I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning, and there were 300 orders on our website for the book. And I was like, oh, isn't that cool? Like, we're going to sell 300 copies of this book. That's great. And then it was just like every minute there'd be like another order and another order. And then I realized that our distributor at the time had failed to propagate the data for this title. So the book was not available anywhere except on our own website. You couldn't buy it on Amazon or anywhere else. So it was an interesting sort of confluence of, I wouldn't say problems, but like events, let's say. So we were getting all of the mail orders, and our distributor apologized profusely, and they're like, oh, no, that's okay. This has actually been pretty great. And so, we rushed a reprint of 10,000 copies as fast as we could. And back then, in 15 years ago, you could get books in 2 to 3 weeks, so that wasn't really a big deal. And this kind of repeated a few times, and this was enough to get people talking about the book and telling their friends. So it wasn't just these 2 reviews anymore. It was kind of like everybody was like, this book was like maybe our first book ever that was intergenerational, where it would be like grandmother and granddaughter and their mom in between them, like all 3 of them could appreciate the same book because of the way it was like contemporary, but also like 70s-esque. And so we had never really done that before successfully, and we had never really tried to do that before. And then so for her, we went back to the author and we said, hi, would you like to write a second book, because your book is actually doing really well? And Raleigh is very modest, so she like kind of reluctantly accepted. And 2 years later, she had finished writing and compiling and researching what is now Make It Last, which came out in 2012. And like most publishers at that time, we carefully evaluated how many copies to print. And we really weren't sure, because, we had this book, which had now, we had sold about 80,000 copies of Make Your Place at that point. And so we were like, okay, so if that one sold 80,000, like obviously this one, it's going to sell more than 3,000. And, it's all those things we considered and talked about earlier. But, there's a wisdom that I learned about 2 years later, that 90% of sequel books sell 10% of what the previous book did. So like whenever something has like, number 2 on the cover, you're going to sell 90% less than the first book did, which, I didn't know. I just thought like, oh, people that like her books and like her work are going to buy this book too. So, we thought, okay, 10,000, that's like a reasonable number. Like we could probably sell 10,000 fairly easily. And, it wasn't like entirely wrong. It's gonna, and then this went out in our distributor's catalog. We received interest from the producer of Anderson Cooper's daytime talk show, which I cannot remember the title of, but that was like one of those shocking moments where we were like, she's going to be on television. She's going to be on Anderson Cooper. Like, that's so wild. And the author, of course, is a nice young woman who like writes about cleaning her house without using chemicals and like wounds and how to, make things that you love last longer. So she was obviously way too shy to go on television and was kind of like, do I have to? Because she was rather horrified. So, but nonetheless, we asked her to send a reel of herself, to like, so they could see what she would be like on camera. And she did that. And then I began to remember how she had excused herself from joining us on our 2010 tour at the last minute, citing that she's really a homebody and not really suited to life on the road, which, like, to be fair, that's very much who she is, So, and, this is an author who is very special, she didn't have an email address when we like signed her first book. She would mail us master pages when we started working together, which was really, like probably is wilder now than it was then. But, to this day, she doesn't use social media accounts. She's like lives a quiet life at home and, she has a cell phone and an email now, but it's a different, she's like not embracing technology open-heartedly. But this was still no matter, because after extensive pressure to come out as gay on his own talk show, Anderson Cooper outed himself in an email to his colleagues while doing off-grid reporting in Africa. So like he waited until he would be unreachable to confirm the rumors about him, which is, a probably very difficult personal choice. And then CNN aired a 9-minute segment where they examined and like rated how well he did at coming out and like the role of reporters coming out in 2012 and, just things that seemed like horrendously inappropriate and weird to do. But, and then his television's network, Time Warner, promptly did not review his show for a 3rd season, and they cited soft ratings as the reason for that, but it really very much was clear what the actual reasons were. And so Raleigh was off the hook. She was not going to be on Anderson's show because Anderson's show would not exist anymore, which is a bummer. But to be fair, I've never watched the show, so maybe the show wasn't any good. But so back in Microcosm land, we started to panic a little about Make It Last. So we started reaching out to people who had reviewed her book's favor in the past. Most people passed on it. It's the idea of that you don't, reviewing the like, oh, this person that you really liked the book of has a new book. It sounds really good, but it's not always compelling. The vegans didn't like it because it wasn't entirely vegan, so those reviewers wouldn't touch it. And then our distributor said that they were getting sort of a cold reception because the cover didn't work in their opinion. The mom blogger that had like popularized it in the first place, she wrote a fairly soft review that sold about 30 copies, versus like the tens of thousands she had sold previously. And so that was what it was. We sold 2,200 copies of Make It Last in the first year of publication and 1,000 in the second year. So that's, kind of not 90% less, But, compared to, we had sold about 80,000 of Make Your Place in the first 5 years. So that was pretty disappointing to sell, 3,200 versus 80,000. And that is, no, Annalisa, that is not overstocked in Portland, but I love that you asked that question. And there's a happy ending to this story, so hold on to your hats. By 2016, we were only selling about 500 per year, and that was about the point when we were like, okay, this is like kind of gonna peter out. Like, I think at one point we had 7 years of inventory on that book, and we were like, what are we gonna do? But fast forward to today, and there's only 2 entire boxes left in our whole warehouse. What changed? Well, like, we stuck with the book. We knew the book was evergreen in that it was how it was developed and like what the value of the book was. We had learned from our mistakes. We designed a new cover as far back as 2014, which we will now publish in a new edition this fall. And so, it did take 12 years, which is not a nice even round number, like 10 years for a second edition. But, it's like, we know the content of the book is good. It was just like sort of the way that we had packaged it and handled it that wasn't quite perfect. So, the fundamental problem wasn't with the book itself. It was with the way that we handled it, the packaging. But, the other thing is that, like, once you publish a book, even if the packaging isn't quite right or the cover isn't quite right, the minute you change it, that's when people will come to you and be like, but I liked it the old way, and that's sort of the way that these things go. Like, when we record the Unfuck Your Brain audiobook, we didn't intend to sell millions of those. So we didn't put as much time or effort into the production as we would have had we known that. And then when I went back to the audiobook distributor and I said, like, should we re-record it? They said, oh no, don't do that, because the minute you mess with it, you're going to ruin it. So even if you make it better, people aren't going to see it that way. They're going to see it as different, and they're going to be attached to the way that it used to be. So, in this case, it's like we're evolving it just a bit. And this was the same way with her other book, Fix Your Clothes. As soon as we changed the cover for the second edition, stores were like, oh, I like the old cover. Like, it wasn't working. So, that's sort of, people get emotionally attached to the decisions that you make, and that's part of the issue too. But also, we just weren't reaching the right retailers with that cover, with that distribution setup, with, how we were doing outreach. So when we took back our distribution in 2018, sales of this title increased immediately. Like, that was kind of the turning point to be like, oh, we're no longer overstocked. Oh, we're going to run out. Oh, okay, wow, we went from having 7 years to having 4 years to having 6 months, and that's kind of a wild shift. So, we know our bread and butter are sort of like these small independent retailers who can, like, give a book a little place on the shelf and sell a few copies each month, and then we have thousands of stores like that, and that's kind of what works. And so that's what we design a book like that for. And then that's sort of like that's the three-legged stool where, like, everybody benefits from the way the book is developed. So everybody is, like, incentivized to do their part, the author, us, the retailer, any other partner that's involved. And so, back in the remaindering world, where Make It Last will never be experienced, there's a few dozen different remainder dealers, mostly in the United States, but there's a handful in the UK as well. They review books that are available on auction, which are normally sold as whole lots, meaning you have to buy them all. So if somebody has 3,800 copies of something and you give a price that would be acceptable to you, it's to buy every one of those copies, not to buy 6 or 4 or 100 or whatever. So from there, those copies are shipped to that remainder dealer's warehouse, and then they're broken down into smaller quantities. And, the natural question is like, what happens to those books? Well, most of them end up for sale on Amazon, where they, underbid the publisher's price. And there's a chain that doesn't exist in Oregon, but does exist in Ohio, called Half Price Books, that has a few hundred stores. And they are pretty guaranteed to get most anything on remainder that they believe they can sell. And then they sell it for, as you might have guessed, half price. The author is not paid royalties on these sales. And that is usually what happens when, eventually the book like works its way down in terms of price until you can get copies for a penny. And that's, on any kind of like secondary retail market, any kind of places that, these books are sold. And there's lots of, Abe Books, thrift books. Those are sort of popular places. And a lot of these places also will resell on Amazon. And, it's like the stuff that used to be in people's basements is now like finding its way to the secondary market, similarly to like a used bookstore model. And so, and this is the like kind of what popularized Amazon was the idea that, books were overpriced, and, you could really get anything for a penny if you were patient enough, and you could buy like copies sent for review. You could buy, any number of random things for next to nothing. And, this was probably one of the greatest harms to the industry, that, people would then think of books as like something that didn't retain value as an informational product, which is like really the point of the book, is that it's, a, you're trusting a series of respected authorities to relay information to you. And then this was the major shift in the younger generation of the last 10, I mean, maybe even 5 years, where people said, no, it's like if we continually undervalue the book, then nobody is going to make very good books. And I want books to be good. So that was when we saw people were supporting things at what they actually need to cost to make a book. And then, now you've seen where you can have like the $45 hardcover and people will pay for it because, they like want this item, and not just in a theoretical sense, like they're really willing to, open their wallet, So regardless of the value in the free market, once a book goes on remainder, that's usually the beginning of the end of its life. There's not really a lot of ways to right that ship after that point. It'll gradually reach every secondhand seller and every remainder dealer as they sell smaller and smaller lots to each other. And then they sell them into these book fairs in Asia and the Middle East. And, there's like famous book fairs in Singapore and Malaysia where you can just buy all this stuff. And, there's like entire secondary markets for Bibles the same way, because, like the Bible is the most overprinted book on earth, so it's like, it's the most printed book, but it is not the best selling book. And so something has to become of all of those Bibles, and it is largely the remainder market. So essentially the books get kicked around the not it pile until they all end up somewhere. And, and you'll see cases too, where, sometimes it'll be like an over, Costco or Walmart or Target or Barnes and Noble will buy too many, and then those will be returned, and then those will end up on the remainder market sometimes. And that's similar, but a little bit different, in that it won't destroy the value of the book, because there's a fairly limited number comprising, a minority of the printing, rather than like enough to really just drive the price into the ground. So, the primary thing that, you may recall that earlier this year we offered some books that we had published over 10 years ago on Remainder, and most of those were passed on. So what happens to the books that can't even sell on Remainder, such as those books, which are still in our warehouse because the situation is not so dire that we needed to get them out of here. It was more like we have too many, so let's see if anybody is interested. However, the reason that all of the buyers passed on those titles surprised me. The primary reason is that most vendors warehouse in the East Coast or the Midwest. So the cost of freighting from Portland was prohibitive. There's essentially only 2 buyers who buy on the West Coast really in whole quantities, and neither one was interested. And so one of the key advantages of remaindering, as much as a lot of it is disadvantages, other than, you're cleaning up a mess, essentially, like you're like sweeping the parking lot, is that the buyer pays for shipping. So, because it's essentially like you're not making a lot or you're going to make anything in the sale. So the cost of shipping then becomes a factor for the buyer rather than for the seller when they're deciding what to buy. So, for example, like we sold a lot of books from out of Cleveland that were overstocked there because, those actually didn't even leave Ohio. They just went to Columbus, where there is a remaindering warehouse. So, that was easy. That was sort of a no-brainer for them. But there's other reasons that, obviously remainder dealers just cannot buy everything. So in some cases, it's that, the book's development is just too ethereal. Like, what is the book? Who is it for? There's times where like I cannot figure this out, where I like look at the book and research it, and I'm like, I cannot figure out what this is supposed to be. Or it's so misdeveloped that it looks like one thing, but it's actually another thing. And that can be like a fun case study, but and then, sometimes like a book about current events is, the events are no longer current. So, it's like not written as a history book. So it's simply not relevant anymore. And they can see the writing on the wall. Or like a movie tie-in book will cause the previous edition to go on remainder, things like that. In cases where like the world changed, but the book didn't. And then in other cases, all demand sometimes is just exhausted. Like the book like lived out its natural life, and it's, everybody that's going to read it has read it, so like that can be anything from like a business book where like thinking has changed to like, or like a novel that has like a natural sales plateau that goes up and goes down. There was, however, one publisher where all 39 titles on their offering had 1 to 2 stars as their rating, with numerous disappointed customers offering deep exposition about what exactly they hated about each book. So, it wasn't difficult to figure out why those books were on remainder or why nobody wanted them. But, if a book cannot even be sold for pennies on the dollar, what happens to it? It becomes what is known as pulped, which is the term for book reincarnation. And so these are books that are literally ground back into paper and then turned into new books. So, in some cases you can get like pennies for the value of the material, which, like the recycling money, as if you were like a metal scrapper. But, with the volume of book waste in the system, most of the time you're just happy to not have to pay anymore. You're just happy to have it be like a one and done, where you're like, oh, you'll take them, I'll get them out of here, I'm tired of paying for them. And that's sad, but sometimes it's for the best. So now that we know the horrors of waste caused by overprinting, we're going to have a little reminder about how to prevent it. So, isn't the solution simply to print fewer and reprint as needed? It's a complicated yes, but mostly it's just yes. The hype machine is really powerful, And you can't exactly claim that you printed 100,000 if you actually only printed 3,000, because the advance orders are going to wipe you out before you even begin shipping the book to actual readers. So you need some amount of substantiation for claims like that. And, most publishers struggle with marketing and connecting their ambition and their emotional attachment to each book to the reality of the marketplace. So, as such, they overprint because they're really excited about the book, or they think the book is really cool or good, or, things like that. And I remember how difficult it was when the market first saturated and, we had to reduce. We used to print 4,000 as a low baseline for everything. And then, when that was no longer tenable, that was really emotionally difficult to be like, oh, okay, we cannot just print 4,000 of everything as a baseline. Like, we have to actually consider this, and, our audience will not buy everything that we produce. So, and it took me really a full year to accept that and adjust to it, because, the first year I thought like we just had a fluke year, but that was not what was happening. Now I realize that having better tools to plan ahead is the solution. So, we give ourselves a better sense of what's actually happening and when to pull the trigger on the reprint. You don't want to wait too long or the interest will wane, but you don't want to reprint too soon, because then you risk returns exposure or demand slowing. So, what happened in the case of Grow, we printed 5,000, we sold 5,000. It was 2 months before publication, so we printed 10,000 more, and then we got 2,000 more returned. So we didn't need to reprint at all, but the initial orders were so substantial that we thought we did, and so that can be a difficult, though exciting at the time, thing to have happen. And it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation. And most publishers don't have the tools like we do with Working Lit. They just have to sort of deal with whatever is happening. They have to kind of like shoot in the dark. They're blindly estimating print runs rather than using hard science. So, it is simple and it seems kind of silly, but the answer to saving so many businesses' dreams, bank accounts, the environment, and headaches is to just print fewer copies of each book until you have enough data to make clear decisions. And so that's really the methodology we've moved into. And, emotionally difficult as it is, it's much easier to hit reprint than it is to be like, oh shit, that book was not going to sell 5,000. So, utilize the information that's available to make the best choice based on conservative estimates, and then you can predict the future. And, and it's also good for expectations when you like aim a little lower, because when you aim too high and then you don't achieve that, everybody's going to be bummed. Whereas if you aim a little lower and you reprint, everybody's going to be excited because you then exceeded expectations instead of underperformed. And, even though those things are entirely like semantic, so it's like always like most problems are caused by just setting expectations too high in printing and otherwise, and, but so that is how we move away from material problems and resolve them.
I'm going to ask a question on behalf of one of our staff that contacted me
Oh.
about it in case they're feeling too shy to ask themselves. Can you talk to us about Juggalo Country?
Well, the Juggalo Country is sort of a different type of example. The problem with Juggalo Country is that in the first printing, more than 2/3 of the books had a peeling varnish. So it has the effect, Powell's contacted us as the book came out and they said, the covers are coming off. And so, that's why we have, I think, 1,700 or so of those. And, we didn't have, like, that's not inventory. Like, that's like, we essentially send those out for free in the damages packs, because that seemed to make more sense than just like throwing them all away. It's a good book. It seemed more ethical to do that than to, put more into the landfill when the book itself is good.
Did you just say that's not really inventory?
Yes, because it's the replacement cost on it is 0. Those are the damages. So we have good copies too, but we have a reasonable number of good copies. So we have, 600 or so of like actual copies that are saleable, but we have, 17 or 1800 damaged copies that are not saleable.
Yeah, and it just I'm thinking like it affects Lance's feng shui. Right?
Lance has chimed in to say that they've been tucked away nicely. They're all on an attic shelf far away from where, unless anybody is climbing in the rafters, they're not gonna bump into those.
Would it hurt you to pulp them?
We can just send out a few boxes, periodically rather than pulping them, and then they can be like read by people rather than, like the consequence is the same. It's just like slower. And, and we don't need the space in the rafters. If we did, it would be a different story.
Sarah, what is Sarah saying yes to?
I think Sarah does not want to pulp those books.
As in, yes, it would hurt.
Yeah, I appreciate that you keep saying like the emotional aspects of it, how they play into making business decisions, and just like acknowledging that. Like Kaylin and I have had conversations in our one-on-ones too about, things that like we were talking about. This XYZ is a business decision. It's not an emotional decision or something. So that's an interesting aspect of it.
And so thank you for taking me to task for what perhaps came across as an emotional decision. But yeah, when I did consulting for other publishers, it was that every single time. It would be like, I could look at it and figure it out. And, and it was almost always this was one of the biggest problems. But then when you go to approaches to solve it, they would be like, oh, but I don't want to do that. And you're
Totally.
like, well, this is what you need to do. Like, this is the only rational thing. And they're like, well, I wouldn't want to do it at all if I had to do that. And I was like, I cannot help you then.
Yes, having cleaned out my hoarding parents' home, I can acknowledge that there were many illogical decisions.
And so many things do come down to that. And I don't think it's always a bad thing, but I think it's like when you're making pragmatic decisions like that, like a print run emotionally, or, and we ran into this too, we had another book scam that was like overprinted. And so we spent 2020 like giving away 800 of them, and then it was no longer overstocked, and it was like, and some of the staff were like, can't we just pulp them, and you're like, well, we could, like we absolutely could, but like on the other hand, we could like give them to people who would read them. So longtime customers of Microcosm, I swear they know, because sometimes they will be like, they will tell you which ones they already have and to not send those ones again, which is really adorable. So yeah, we like predetermine what is overstocked, and then we put them on those piles, and then those go out with the priority mail orders each day. This has kind of been our approach, because it's like you don't want to flood it, because then it becomes essentially unavailable. And like, it's like we get orders for it. It's not like it's at 0, but we're never, we know that we're
right. But in hindsight, you would completely have adjusted how many you had printed. Like and you wouldn't advocate, if you were doing consulting, you wouldn't advocate for someone to store damaged copies of an old book that we're essentially giving away because we love it. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Well, in this case, like we built our infrastructure to be able to do that in a practical sense. So that's, I guess, the other difference. So the value add here, and this is how this is my methodology that like I made up, like most of my methodology, is that when you give somebody like more books than they purchased, that is like something that they think about and associate with us. And like maybe not everybody is going to be like over the moon overjoyed about it, but they're like, that's something they're going to remember. Like that's the kind of thing where like, people are stoked about it, people are enthusiastic about it. We can only do that obviously with things that are overstocked, but that's just like a much better use of resources, is to like support the people that support us over just destroying books, which is like not a great, use of resources either.
Right, but it's something that you would advocate if it were, if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
needed,
exactly.
yeah.
In my defense,
You're
Scam.
not on trial. I'm just asking,
Scam's print run was not decided on my watch, so I just had to deal with the consequences. But Juggalo Country, it was the printer's error, and so the printer discredited us for those books.
right. So
So
you have them for free.
yeah, and so then we were like, oh, that's weird, because then we don't want to destroy them. They didn't ask us to destroy them. They recognized that they had screwed them up, so 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And then, and so that was kind of always been our approach to this matter, is like when we're overstocked on something, we like move it into the giveaways and then move that out of inventory and, get it out of the way and make space. And then, we have an active, oh yeah, and I don't know if you know this or not, Annalisa, but like we have
I know nothing.
You know a few things, but we have an active system where like we look at annual overstock and we look at what moves into giveaway, what, like what we need to look at, consider remaindering. And it's like there's been essentially one book in the last 5 years, and we could have seen it coming, and then there was maybe one book 2 years before that. So it's, we're like, the track record is pretty good, but it's mostly because we cut the print runs, So
Thank
there's
you.
that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it wasn't me who asked the question. Just kidding.
Lance says, do you find that if a book sells out of a printing, does that usually generate more buzz for the next printing, or does it stop sales momentum?
Fantastic question, Lance. That you kind of, so it all depends on the book. So like for a novel, during its like months of release, so if a book had been out for 3 months and you ran out of copies, you might kill the momentum stop the momentum entirely. If it's a book that's like 5 years old, you look at what, is happening in practice. So, and then there's a lot of buggy factors here that like obfuscate the situation. And the biggest one is that if we don't have copies of something, there's probably copies at wholesalers. So there's probably a way to get the book. But if a store has a special order, they may not be able to work that out, or, like right now, like the Practical Witch is reprinting, and we're going to be out for about 2 weeks. It's not going to kill us, even though it's an annual and it's a ticking clock. But, it's like we're going to get more. We're going to fill those wholesaler orders. There's probably some copies floating around because we just ran out, probably yesterday or today. So it's, it'll be fine. It's not going to kill the momentum. If we reprinted that book in December, the momentum would be dead. And, and that's an extreme example because of, it's a planner, but, you can see like analogs of that with other books, like, something, if it's slowing down, sometimes being out of it will actually create momentum, like, because it'll create demand. Like you'll see that for some books. And then in other cases, it'll, people will kind of like not have had that much interest in the first place, so they'll just kind of walk away.
Kaylin asks, can we talk about print on demand, PTOs that print to order?
Yeah, print to
and
order.
why we don't use it.
No, it's print to order and print on demand.
I have salespeople asking me almost every week so I'm excited to hear.
Oh, okay. So the reality is it would make the sale pointless. So because all of our P&Ls are based on the offset numbers. So and looking at print on demand, which is kind of a misnomer because especially these last few years, print on demand was apparently no faster than offset printing, but it comes at 4 times the price. So that essentially like makes it where we have no margin to pay for the costs of using it. We can't pay the author, we can't pay ourselves. It's essentially like we're better off selling them a different book or waiting, and we've looked into it with dozens of different, we used to use it, and then we're like, this makes no sense. Like, you can't, the only way it would make sense is if we built all of our systems on the assumption of using that and built all of our pricing, like our cover prices, on that instead of the way we do it now on the offset printing. We could have it where the price was higher, but we would need to do that from the launch, because otherwise the reality is that people are going to like think the book is suddenly just more expensive and then cheaper again. So and we have a few titles that have gone both ways. We did a run of Biketopia that way, and then we were like, it's better to, well, we kept the increased price, but we went back to offset because that just made so much more sense, in the end, that you're like, the like the book has to support, like the three-legged stool has to work, like the book has to support us as much as it supports the author and the store.
So like our policy of not really remaindering things, is that like mainly because of our emotional attachment to the books, or is that because of our commitment to sustainability, or is that a marketing strategy, or all of the above?
Wow, I'm really being called out today, which I appreciate. You should always do that. The principles of remaindering are built on the assumption that a book has no more life in it, whereas like we almost never see that. I guess the classic bicycle coloring book would be a perfect example of why we don't remainder. So we published that book in 2017. It came out. It didn't sell very well. We're the normal publisher. An abnormal publisher who is not as mainstream as we are would have remaindered everything left after a year, because we sold not I think we sold 600 or 800 or something that first year, and our distributor sold almost none the second year, and then we started to see the returns, and and it was one of those books where I was like, I knew there was an audience for it, so I knew that wasn't the right move, that we just weren't, they're going after, they're trying to put it in somewhere like Barnes and Noble, or a place that it's just not quite right for. And so it was not until we took back our own distribution in 2019 that like we really started to sell that book, 2020 really, that it really started to sell. And so we've sold more in the last 2 years, or the last I don't know, say 4 years, than the first 4 years that the book was in publication, so it's a weird thing like that, where if we had remaindered that book, that wouldn't have happened, and that harms sort of the life of the whole thing, because you can't really get a do-over on something like that, whereas like I know that's one of the ones that we're having to restock in Cleveland, and it's not like it's selling gangbusters. And I'm sure if I thought about it for a minute, I could think of a better example where like, or like Make Your Place or Make It Last would be like the better example, where it's like it did kind of crappy out of the gate. We normally would have remaindered all those, but it was apparent that it was going to start moving,
I do want to add that we do so these overstock books, like the books we give away, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, these are books that we have more than a 10-year supply of based on our current sales metrics. Is that right?
Yeah.
And we'll give away like whatever the number is over 10 years. And then sometimes they bounce back. We do also sell these books, and a lot of what Abby does is coming up with different ways to package these books, either on Kickstarter or in bundles, so that they can kind of sell side by side with our more popular titles and hopefully build up more of an audience for those books.
Right. Yeah. And that's, yeah, I mean, and that's pretty much it. So it's like one part marketing, it's one part, it's like giving back to the fans, but there are also cases where like people discover the book through that, or they like, those tend to be the photos that people post to social media when they like get their order and they're like, look at all these other books I got, and then that's when their friend is like, oh, whoa, that book looks cool. Things like that are very real. And so it's not, yeah, it's tough to really like line it out into a simple singular thing, because it's a bigger multi-pronged strategy, where
I would say it also makes sense to keep the book in print, because then we still have ebook rights, and we can, like, when things come along like Humble Bundle or, knock on wood, book.io, that book can have a new life in ebook.
yeah.
Is that a legitimate consideration, Joe? Or am I making that up?
There needs to be life in the first place but no, there's been cases where we've created a secondary life that like was how we like made money on the digital rights more than we did on the print rights, because the print rights obviously are like, the print run is the expensive part. Yeah, but it's it's like, and we've always done it this way. We've sold books on remainder before, but once you find out that it kind of destroys the life of that book, and you don't get that, and traditional publishing is more built on the idea that you're only focused on what's new, which just doesn't make any sense, because every publisher makes their money on their older books, not on their new books. So it's just like fundamentally broken that they're stuck in this like hype cycle of promoting books that like everybody knows are going to be forgotten in a year, and most of them are going to be flops. Just by numbers. So like you really need to nurture the back end.
Joe, I want to record or rewind the recording. Did I just hear you say we've always done it this way?
Called out.
Burn. See, look
Sick
at that.
Burn. Sick burn.
But we've actually, I guess it's not entirely true that we started out this way, and then when we learned about remaindering, we were like, oh, okay, we could do it that other way. And then we were like, oh no, the other way doesn't actually make any sense. Like, our way actually works better, unless we're in a case where we're like, we've remaindered books when we've been losing rights, and that's made sense. But other than that, when like the decision is made, it's because essentially like when you remainder the book, you're also giving up the right to reprint that book in the future. In
Right,
most,
you don't
every
have
case.
you don't have to keep 2,500 on hand to retain the right. Like, you could trim it down or something. I'm just
Yeah.
But what
And
are
so-
the costs to keep 2,500 on hand for us?
Right. Yeah, and that's how we've looked at it. Yeah. So this has been, and we've been very tidy. Like, we haven't, the only books that we've published since we opened the warehouse in Cleveland that were overstocked were it was I think it was the 2022 Practical Witch. That was and it's, like, considering how many we sold, it's not severe. So it's, things like that. And, and obviously nobody's going to like buy those on remainder because it's like 2 years old, but
it's so 2 years ago.
but we can sell those with the Kickstarter in every successive project. So like in future years, we'll sell down the box at a time. So it's not like a lost cause. And so we, I guess like we're differently industrious than most people. Like and this is sort of how we've been so successful at like maintaining our back catalog.
But like, what is our cost to warehouse this overstock compared to like what are the benefits of warehousing this overstock in numbers?
My gym membership is putting things where nobody, where they're out of the way. And, I rearranged the warehouse. That was I like many people, I put on some pounds at the beginning of COVID, and then I rearranged the warehouse 3 times. And then I found that pretty quickly that problem was no longer a problem. And so, and that's like incredibly rigorous, obviously. Like I moved thousands of boxes 3 times. But the purpose of that project was to make it so that we weren't using real estate and we weren't incurring cost. So really the only time that hurts us is when we have essentially dead stock in Cleveland, because the way the bays and the layouts are set up in Portland now, it's designed to be inobtrusive. So you'll have your stack of title, and then those have like fairly successive rapid turns. So the only time you really get into trouble is when you have these just like outrageous quantities using up valuable space. So I just made it so they're never invaluable space. They're, in the rafters, and so we get down a box at a time, and that's easy. When we got quotes from Simon and Schuster for like what it would cost for them to do our fulfillment, and they were charging about double what we currently pay doing it ourselves. But that, and that was pretty consistent too, where like the traditional wisdom is about a penny and a half per month per book. So, that's 18 cents per book per year. And ours was about half of that, if we were, had the books on a pallet in a place that was like prime real estate. So, as it is, it's, the only real cost is like if it's in the way, if we need to move it, if it's like, obscuring something else that's important. So that's the other way that we eliminated that cost. Maybe not entirely, because it's like, on some level, like, you can always figure out a way to use space, but it's not space that would otherwise be used. So that's my like roundabout way of saying that it's like probably like a 16th of a penny per book per year would be like my rough estimate.
Joe, do you have an overstock report for our published titles for 2023 yet?
Of course I do. What kind of?
Would you share it with the class?
Oh, sure. And
Sorry.
you can see what goes on around here.
Can you tell him at the back of the class causing problems?
What's new? You can, the real shocker on there was that there were no new titles added to the overstock report this year, which I was like, that's wild. Like, how did that, and it might, for what it's emotional, my first thought was, oh, that's incorrect. I thought like, oh, we'll have to keep probing on that until we figure out which ones they are. And then we're like, oh no, we like don't have 2023 overstock books that we published, which was kind of
But you just
wild.
If you just like you just did, like you just acknowledge, if you say, oh, that, you know what, that's actually an emotional decision, like that makes it like comforting or like more human to know. Like if you're just like, also, like that's why we did it. Like just being honest amongst ourselves, I think that helps.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I've done that a lot today. That's helpful to know what your thinking is.
Because, well, I mean, you have to rationalize it in some way. So the honest way is probably the best way to do it.
Much more preferable than.
So I guess my question, Joe, is when are we going to run out of 10 years or more overstocked published titles to send out in priority mail envelopes?
So we go through about 3 cartons a week. So that's our rate of consumption. Fortunately, and then, obviously, like some books, it's 176 to a carton. Some books, it's 20 to a carton. So let's operate on like the median, not the mean. So let's assume like 40 per carton. And so you'll have, let's see, we had, it was 120 overstock cartons in total the last time I ran it, which would have been a year ago. So, we have like 2 more years.
Okay.
In
So we could publish another
20
dud.
Right. So 2026 really will be our time. And and like some other things, I guess it's probable that by 2026 we'll have published one more dud, which is okay. Our greatest dud was Katrina Sandcastles, and that was a full 10 years ago now. So but we're down to like the last bit of the giveaways on those. So like I've had customers complain that they've gotten that book for free multiple times. But, we paid for it. It's in the black. We just don't need them around here anymore. So
Can you update us about older books that still haven't earned out?
There's 3. Riot Woman will earn out this year for certain. It's about $300 in the red. So probably not this month, but probably in February. And then it's just Chocolatology, which is about $1,800 in the hole. And then it's Amika's World, which is, I don't know, 3,000 in the hole, maybe. Let me take a look. But yeah, it's really just those 3, or no, it's about 4,300 in the hole. So,
Amika.
so
I have asked for an update about how Amika is doing, by the way, but I haven't heard back yet.
Mm-hmm. So that's, but all 3 of those, we're so much more dialed in on all these systems now. I mean, I swear we acquired Riot Woman before we acquired Amika's World or Chocolatology. So, like all 3 of those were really acquisitions problems rather than, or should I say mistakes rather than, like any other kind of issue, because it's like ultimately, no matter what anybody else does or chooses, we're ultimately responsible for our choices. So there's some emotional truth.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
on Twitter at Microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at Microcosm_pub,
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.